He didn't look at my face. He looked at the patch. The room was full of RCMP officers, retired brass, provincial ministers, people whose names appeared in press releases and annual reports. It was a formal recognition dinner in Ottawa, the kind with linen tablecloths and speeches that lasted too long. I was there representing my unit, standing near the back wall with a glass of water I hadn't touched, when the older man in the dark suit stopped mid-sentence and stared at my jacket. Not my medals. Not my rank. The small embroidered patch I'd sewn onto the inside lining of my dress jacket, folded back so it was visible. Something I'd been wearing for 3 months without anyone noticing. He stepped toward me slowly. His name tag said Deputy Commissioner, retired. His eyes didn't leave the patch. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I almost said it was decorative. Almost. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away in January." The man's jaw tightened. He looked up at me for the first time. "What was his name?" "Robert Gagnon," I said. "He lived in Sudbury." The deputy commissioner was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he said very carefully, "We need to speak privately." And that was the moment I understood that my grandfather, the man my own family had spent 30 years dismissing, the man my mother called sad and my uncle called a burden, might have been something none of us ever took the time to see. My grandfather, Robert Gagnon, was, by every visible measure, unremarkable. He lived alone in a small house on the east side of Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of neighborhood where the driveways crack in February and nobody fixes them until June. He drove a 2003 Civic that spent most winters buried under a tarp. He kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that he tended with more care than most people give their children. He didn't own a cell phone until he was 71, and even then he used it mostly to check the weather. He never talked about his work. Not to my mother, not to my uncle, not to anyone, as far as I knew. When I was young and asked what he used to do before he retired, he would smile in that quiet way of his and say, "Oh, a bit of this, a bit of that." Then he'd go back to whatever he was doing. My mother took that as evidence of failure. "A man who can't account for his own career," she used to say, "is a man who has something to be ashamed of." My uncle was more direct. "Your grandfather had potential," he told me once, when I was about 14. "He just never did anything with it. They weren't cruel people. They just had a particular idea of what success looked like, and my grandfather didn't fit inside it. He had no pension they knew of, no professional associations, no framed certificates on any wall. He lived quietly, spent little, asked for nothing. When he got sick, it happened the way things often happen with people who live alone, gradually, and then suddenly. A neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Bouchard, who brought him soup when the roads were bad, called my mother in November to say he had fallen twice in 2 weeks and wasn't eating properly. My mother said she'd look into it. She didn't. I was working in Toronto at the time, 6 months into a position with the Ontario Provincial Police. I called him every Sunday. He never told me he was struggling. He'd ask about my cases, my colleagues, whether I was eating enough. The last time I spoke to him before the hospital, he told me the tomatoes hadn't survived the first frost, and he was thinking about trying garlic next year. Mrs. Bouchard called me directly in January, on a Tuesday morning. My grandfather had collapsed in the kitchen. An ambulance had come. He was at Health Sciences North. I drove 4.5 hours through a snowstorm. By the time I arrived, he was conscious but fading. The doctor used words like significant decline and comfort measures. I sat beside him for 3 days. My mother came once, stayed for an afternoon, and drove back to Mississauga because she had a work event. My uncle sent flowers. My cousin sent a text that said, "Thinking of you both." On the second night, when it was just the two of us and the sound of the heating unit clicking on and off, my grandfather reached over and held my hand. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Of course I did," I said. He looked at the window. Outside, Sudbury in January. Dark and cold and still. "I was never much," he said quietly. "Not in the ways that counted to your mother." I told him that wasn't true. He smiled the way he always did when he thought I was being kind rather than honest. He died on a Thursday morning, just before 6. The room was pale and gray. I was holding his hand. When I called my mother, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I suppose we should arrange something simple." We did. A small service at a funeral home in Sudbury. 12 people, Mrs. Bouchard. 3 men from his street. A woman from the Legion who said she'd seen him at Remembrance Day ceremonies every year for as long as she could remember, though he never wore anything, no medals, no pins, just a poppy. My uncle gave a short eulogy that managed to say almost nothing about who my grandfather actually was. He mentioned the garden. He mentioned that Robert had always been self-sufficient. I didn't speak. I wasn't ready. Afterward, I went back to his house before the estate lawyers arrived. I needed to be there alone, in the rooms that still smelled like him, like coffee and wood and something faintly chemical I could never identify. Most of what I found was ordinary. A lifetime of careful, modest living in cardboard boxes, old coats, stacks of Canadian Geographic going back to the 90s, a set of tools so well maintained they looked new. In the back of his bedroom closet, behind a row of flannel shirts still on their hangers, I found a shoebox sealed with electrical tape. Inside was an envelope, a small leather notebook, and the patch. The patch was about the size of my palm, dark fabric, almost black, with a design I didn't recognize, a stylized bird in profile, angular, precise, the kind of image that looked like it meant something specific to someone. No words. No numbers. I turned it over. On the back, in my grandfather's handwriting, 3 words. Keep this safe. I read the envelope next. His handwriting again, careful and unhurried, the way he did everything. If you found this, it means you were the one who came. I always knew it would be you. There are things about my life I was never permitted to explain. Not to your mother, not to anyone. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm asking you to know that it was real, and that it mattered, even if no one ever said so. If someone important ever recognizes what you're holding, let them talk. Just listen. You'll know what to do. I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. I kept the patch. I sewed it into the lining of my dress jacket without fully knowing why. Something about it felt like carrying him forward. 3 months later, I was in Ottawa. The Deputy Commissioner's name was Martin Delacroix. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who moved through formal rooms with practiced ease. He led me to a small anteroom off the main hall, closed the door, and stood very still for a moment before he spoke. "Your grandfather," he said. "How much did he tell you?" "Almost nothing," I said. "He told me almost nothing about any of it." Delacroix nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he expected. "Robert Gagnon," he said, and the way he said the name made my throat tighten, not with nostalgia, with something that looked a lot like respect. I haven't heard that name spoken out loud in a long time. "You knew him?" I asked. "In a professional capacity," he said carefully, "for a significant period." I waited. "There are units within Federal Security Services," he began, "that do not appear in any organizational chart available to the public. They exist to handle situations that require complete operational discretion. No records. No formal acknowledgement. If the work succeeds, it didn't happen. If it fails, it also didn't happen." "He was in one of those units," I said. "For nearly 15 years, Delacroix said. "I thought about my mother's voice. He just never did anything with it." "What did he do?" I asked. Delacroix looked at the wall for a moment. "Counterintelligence, primarily. Infiltration and extraction. He worked on files involving organized crime, foreign intelligence, domestic threats that never made the news because they were resolved before they could." He paused. "He was very good, one of the best I worked alongside." "Then why doesn't anyone know?" I asked. "Why was there no record?" "Because the record existing would have endangered people who are still alive," he said. "Assets, informants, individuals whose safety depended on the operations your grandfather ran remaining invisible." He looked at me. "That patch is an internal identifier. It marks someone cleared for operations at a level that doesn't officially exist. There are almost none left. Most were destroyed when the unit was formally dissolved." "Why did he keep it?" Delacroix was quiet for a moment. "Because some people need proof," he said. "Not for others. For themselves." I thought about the words on the back of the patch. "Keep this safe." And then I thought about the letter. It was real, and it mattered, even if no one ever said so. On the drive back to my hotel, I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't turn on the radio. The streets of Ottawa moved past the windows, gray and lit and full of people going somewhere. I thought about my grandfather making his garden, checking the weather on his phone, sitting alone at Remembrance Day with nothing on his chest. I called my mother when I got to the hotel room. "I need to tell you something about Grandpa," I said. She sighed faintly, the way she always did when his name came up, a sound that meant she was already preparing to be uninterested. What about him? A senior federal official recognized his patch tonight. The one I told you I found. He told me Grandpa worked in classified counterintelligence for 15 years. There was a pause. What do you mean, classified? I mean, he ran operations that don't appear in any public record. He protected people. He dismantled threats. He did it without anyone knowing, and apparently without anyone being able to know. My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That sounds like something he would have invented." I hung up. I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark hotel room thinking about all the times I'd watched my grandfather sit at the edge of family gatherings, nursing his coffee, listening to conversations he was never invited into, my uncle holding court about his business, my mother talking about my cousin's achievements, my grandfather nodding quietly, asking questions about other people, never mentioning himself. I used to think it was shyness. Later I thought it was sadness. Now I understood it differently. He wasn't absent from those conversations because he had nothing to say. He was absent because everything he had to say was something he couldn't. I started asking questions the way I'd been trained to, not officially, not through any channel that would raise flags. Carefully, quietly, following threads. I reached out to a retired RCMP officer I'd met during a training course, a woman in her 60s named Pat Renner, who had a reputation for knowing things she wasn't supposed to know. I described the patch. I told her my grandfather's name. There was a long silence on the phone. "Bob Gagnon," she said finally. "Not a question. You knew him?" "I knew of him," she said. "You hear names in this work. Certain names come up in certain contexts, always in passing, always attached to something that got handled before it became a problem." She paused. I heard his name more than once. "What kind of contexts?" "The kind where people are alive today who wouldn't be otherwise," she said simply. That night I went through the leather notebook again. I'd been through it before and found mostly sequences of numbers and letters that meant nothing to me, dates, coordinates, short codes. But now I looked at the margins. In the top corner of certain pages, small and precise, the same bird from the patch. Marked against specific entries. Not decorative. A flag. I photographed every page. I drove to Sudbury the following weekend. Not to see family. To see Mrs. Bouchard. She opened the door before I knocked, as if she'd been expecting me. She was in her mid-70s, sharp-eyed and warm, with the particular steadiness of someone who has spent a long life paying close attention to the people around her. She made tea. We sat at her kitchen table. "He was a good man," she said, before I'd asked anything. "Better than people gave him credit for." "How long did you know him?" I asked. 22 years, she said. "I moved in next door in 2002. He was already there." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "He never talked about himself. Not once. But he showed up. That's what I can tell you. Every time something happened on that street, a broken furnace in February, a woman 2 doors down whose husband left and took the car, a family whose kids needed school supplies in September, Robert showed up. He didn't make a thing of it. He just handled it and moved on." "Did he ever tell you anything about his work?" I asked. She smiled. "He told me he used to work for the government." I asked what he did. He said, "Mostly I listened." She looked at her tea. I didn't ask again. You could tell there were things he carried that he wasn't going to set down. I asked her about the Legion. "He went every year," she said. "Never wore anything. People would ask. He always said he didn't need to." She paused. "I think he felt it would be dishonest, wearing something he couldn't explain." I sat with that for a moment. On the drive home, I called my mother again. This time she answered on the first ring, which surprised me. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, before I could speak. "And?" A pause. "I don't know what to do with it," she said quietly. "He never told us." "Why didn't he tell us?" "Because he couldn't," I said. "It wasn't stubbornness. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting the people his work involved." Another pause. Longer this time. "I called him difficult," she said. "For years I called him difficult. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. He called me every month," she continued. "I let most of them go to voicemail." I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Not grief exactly. Something that came before grief. That sharp, unwelcome arrival of understanding. "I know," I said. "I don't think I can fix that," she said. "No," I said. "But you can do something with what you know now." A week after that, Deputy Commissioner Delacroix contacted me again. He wanted to meet once more, at a veteran support office in Canada, a low building with a small Canadian flag out front, and a receptionist who looked at me like she'd been told I was coming. Delacroix was already inside. So were two other men, both older, both in civilian clothes, both carrying themselves in that particular way that told you they had worn uniforms for a long time. One of them placed a thin folder on the table. "We can't share classified documents," Delacroix said, "but we can share what's been formally declassified." Which isn't much, but it's something. The pages had been heavily redacted, black bars over names, locations, operational details, but enough remained to trace the shape of things. References to joint federal operations in the 90s and early 2000s, counterintelligence work targeting foreign interference in Canadian institutions, extraction of protected individuals, and in the margins of one page, a handwritten notation, primary contact, RG, recommend commendation. Not possible under current parameters. Recommend commendation, I said. Delacroix nodded. He was cited multiple times internally. None of it could be formalized. Because formalizing it would expose the operation, I said. And the people he protected, the older man beside Delacroix said, some of whom are still living under different identities. I stared at the table for a moment. My grandfather, cited for commendation. My grandfather, recommended and passed over not because he failed but because his success had to remain invisible. He died alone, I said. His family was 20 minutes away and no one came. No one answered that. There was nothing to say. I want you to understand something, Delacroix said after a moment. What your grandfather did, the specific work, the duration, the consistency, it was exceptional. The unit he worked with had officers from multiple agencies. Most of them moved on to decorated public careers. Your grandfather was offered that. More than once. He declined. I looked up. Why? He said the work mattered more than the recognition, Delacroix said. He said if you started doing the work for the credit, you'd eventually compromise the work to protect the credit. I sat with that for a long time on the drive home. That evening I went to my parents' house. My mother had called my uncle. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee he wasn't drinking. They both looked older to me somehow, or maybe just smaller. I put the photocopies on the table. The letter. The photographs of the notebook pages. My uncle read slowly. My mother read more quickly, then went back to the beginning and read again. Her hands were steady, but her breathing wasn't. This was him, my uncle said finally. It wasn't a question. Yes, I said. He put the papers down. He looked at the table. I made a joke once, he said. At Christmas. I said the most impressive thing he ever did was stay out of trouble. His voice was flat. He was sitting right there. I know, I said. I was there. My uncle rubbed his face. He didn't say anything. He never did. My mother had been quiet through all of this. Now she looked up at me. The last time I spoke to him, she said slowly, I told him not to call so much. I said I was busy. She pressed her lips together. He said okay. I remember thinking he sounded tired. I told myself he was just getting old. The room was quiet. He wasn't performing humility, I said. He wasn't hiding something to be mysterious. He carried things he wasn't allowed to put down, and the only people who could have made that easier chose not to. My uncle looked up at me. His eyes were red. We didn't deserve him, he said. I didn't argue with that. My mother asked a few days later if we could hold a second service. Not military, not formal. Just a gathering for the people who had actually known him. She organized it herself, which surprised me. She called Mrs. Bouchard. She reached out to the Legion. She found, through Delacroix, 2 former colleagues of my grandfather's who were willing to attend privately, without publicity, without any acknowledgement of their own histories. The gathering was at the Sudbury Legion Hall on a Saturday in April. About 30 people. The snow had almost finished melting. Pale light came through the windows. There were no speeches about heroism. No one mentioned counterintelligence or classified operations. There were just stories. Mrs. Bouchard talked about the time my grandfather fixed her furnace at midnight in February and refused to take anything for it. A man from the street talked about the year his wife got sick and my grandfather mowed their lawn every week from May to October without being asked, and never said a word about it. One of the former colleagues, a quiet man named Claude, said only that Robert Gagnon had been the most trustworthy person he'd ever worked beside, and that those who had worked with him knew what that meant, even if they couldn't say so. My mother cried. My uncle stood very straight and stared at the floor. I held the patch in my hand through most of it. Afterward, at the grave, my mother placed a small bunch of daffodils, his favorite, she said, though I'd had no idea she remembered that. My uncle stood beside her. He didn't speak. He just stood there, which was its own kind of accounting. I placed the patch at the base of the headstone for a moment. The stone was new. My mother had arranged it. His name, his years, and below them. He showed up. That was all. Nothing about service, nothing about silence, just the truest thing any of us could say about him. I thought about what it must have cost him, not the operations, not the risk those he'd chosen, and he'd chosen them clear-eyed, for reasons that were his own. I meant the other cost, the long years of being measured against a standard he could never explain himself against. The holidays where he sat at the edges of rooms and listened to people dismiss him and said nothing, not because he had no defense, but because the defense would have harmed others. The love he offered in the only way he could, by showing up, by fixing things, by being present without fanfare, and the way it was received as evidence of smallness rather than its opposite. He had known the cost from the beginning. He had paid it anyway. In the weeks after, things shifted in my family. Slowly, imperfectly, the way things actually shift rather than the way they do in stories. My mother began volunteering at a veterans support organization in Mississauga, not grandly, not publicly, just one afternoon a week, doing whatever needed doing. My uncle started visiting the Sudbury house his father had lived in, before it sold, just to sit in the backyard for an hour. One evening my mother asked me about the patch. "Do you still carry it?" she said. "Yes," I said. She nodded. "Does it feel heavy?" I thought about that. "It feels like a reminder," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I wish I'd let him remind me sooner," she said. A month after the gathering, Delacroix sent me a letter in the mail. He was retiring that spring. He had included a short handwritten note at the bottom of the typed page. "Your grandfather once told me that the best work leaves no signature, that the goal was never to be credited, it was to make sure the credit was no longer necessary. That idea is less common now than it used to be. I hope you'll carry it with you." I put the letter in the shoebox with the notebook, with his patch, with the letter he wrote me. The box that no longer felt like something hidden. It felt like a record. Quiet, and complete, and true. One morning in May, I drove alone to the cemetery. Early, before the day started properly, while the grass was still wet and the light had that particular quality it gets in northern Ontario in spring, pale and clean and without expectation. I stood at the headstone for a long time. I thought about all the things I used to believe success required. Visibility, titles, the kind of accomplishments that looked the same to everyone who saw them. I'd been raised in that belief. Most of us were. And then I thought about a man who tended his garden and checked the weather and showed up in February with tools when the furnace broke, who carried 15 years of things that could never be said, and never asked anyone to account for what that cost him. "I see you," I said, quietly, to the headstone. "I think I finally see you." The morning was still. Somewhere across the cemetery a crow called once and went quiet. I placed the patch against the stone, held it there for a moment, and then put it back in my pocket, where it belonged. My family still carries the weight of what we didn't do. I don't think that goes away. But alongside it now there is something else, an awareness that changed the way we sit at tables together, the way we listen when someone speaks quietly, the way we notice the people who help without making a production of it. My grandfather never needed us to understand his work. He just needed us to be present with him. That was the only thing he ever asked for, and we gave him so little of it for so long. I'm still a police officer. I still believe in structure and service and showing up, but my idea of what that means has changed since January. It's no longer about recognition. It's about what you leave behind and the people whose lives you touched. Not the acknowledgement you received, the presence you chose to give. If you've been listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if there's someone in your life who lives quietly, who helps without announcing it, who has never once demanded that you notice them, go notice them. Don't wait for a shoebox. Don't wait for someone to tell you who they were after they're gone. The quietest people are often carrying the most, and the only thing most of them ever wanted was for someone to sit with them long enough to know it. Thank you for being here. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories about the people who carried things in silence, you're always welcome here at Still Bearing.